the Shroud of Turin. It's an overlap between science, pathology, with history.
Why is this the greatest unsolved mystery? Because it relates to the greatest story ever told.
If the shroud is authentic, then it's the burial shroud of Jesus. This is crazy stuff here.
The evidence for this being the actual burial shroud of Jesus Christ is quite convincing.
All right, well, welcome to Questioning Christianity. The Shroud of Turin is maybe the most controversial historical artifact in human possession. It was considered to be an illegitimate fraud for a long time due to carbon dating tests in 1988, and yet a host of more recent scientific discoveries are overturning that consensus and leading many former skeptics to turn in faith to now believe in the authenticity of this shroud. I have the privilege today of having on one of these former shroud skeptics, Dr. Jeremiah J Johnston. Jeremiah, it's great to have you on the channel.
Dan, it's so great to be joining you from Prestonwood here in Dallas, Texas, where God has a second home, all the way in Australia, talking to you. And I'm so aware of you and your ministry and scholarship, so I have been really looking forward to this conversation.
Yeah, me too. I've been very excited because the virality of the shroud this year, this is something that hasn't really been on the radar, particularly in apologetics or religious conversations, much at all in the past, and yet seems to be becoming, over the Easter period, front and center. You had this great experience of going on the Michael Knowles podcast and just getting to share that with over 1 million people now who've seen that video. What was that experience like?
Well, they asked me if I would smoke cigars with him on the show, so I had a lot of peer pressure going into it, but it was a great experience, and Michael is a good friend, and it just shows that there's such a hunger for the information that we're discussing today, and it doesn't matter the forum. I mean, I will do any show to talk about Jesus, and there's something in the algorithm which shows that people are very interested in, is there actual evidence for the resurrection, and especially young people. So for those that are joining us right now, if you have a son or a daughter, grandson, granddaughter, Gen X or below, you know, you just need to know that there is an interest among young people in this, unlike anything, Dan, that I've ever seen.
Well, for the sake of those who may be skeptical and are saying, convince me, part of the goal for today will be to put your feet to the fire a little bit as we dive into your both credentials, but particularly your story about your sort of dismissing the shroud originally. And I think like many people just thinking, oh, there's no way that this can be legitimate, a concern to hang up any credibility of your own scholarship then with something which may be a medieval forgery, but then to becoming someone who's obviously now sharing quite extensively and doing teaching on sort of the history and medical analysis and the scientific tests that have been done on the shroud and saying, wait a second, there's more here than we originally give it credit for. So we'll dive into all of the evidence and the for and against, and I'll play devil's advocate a bit along the way and just in terms to ask the questions that people really wanted me to ask as we told them we were going to do an episode on the shroud. But maybe just to kick things off, if you could give a window into your own story and how you came to be interested in researching the shroud, how you've kind of changed your mind a little bit along that process, it'd be great for our listeners just to get a window into it.
Absolutely. So my area of specialization is the Judeo-Christian tradition of the physical bodily resurrection. And so from 2009 to 2012, I read at Oxford and wrote a 93,000-word thesis that's now published in the Jewish and Christian Text monograph series published by T&T Clark Bloomsbury. It's number 21. It's called The Resurrection of Jesus and the Gospel of Peter. I've published it for the dozens in the world who are interested in reading PhD dissertations. So all of my work has been based on the interpretation of resurrection belief in the Judeo-Christian motif. And so in that survey, it took me through quite a bit of datum, everything from the textual analysis to what we know of the historical Jesus, and then what we know of the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus. I was examined, I've published this, so it's not private information. I was examined by William Telford, who believes that the resurrection of Jesus is imaginative storytelling. He's a Gospel of Mark scholar. who studied under William Barclay, who could exegete Scripture phenomenally, but of course denied all miraculous elements of Scripture. So quite a contradiction, and in many various ways, Dan, in my experience at Faculty of Theology at Keble College, I was conditioned to not believe in the Shroud of Turin, the Sudarium. These were mystical Catholic relics, certainly not worthy of our biblical insights. And I remain amazed, and who knows, maybe some of my friends in biblical scholarship are watching this right now. I remain amazed at my colleagues in biblical scholarship, what little they know about the Shroud. They know enough to be dangerous. They appeal to studies that have long since been abandoned as for their agnosticism about the Shroud. And so most Bible scholars today are agnostic about the Shroud. So I fell into that camp. And again, just through writing and publishing and starting our ministry, Christian Thinkers Society, which people can look on christianthinkers.com and they can find out more. I answer questions much like your ministry does. And so many people were asking me about the Shroud of Turin. And of course, I would dismiss it. There's YouTubes out there of me completely dismissing it in a very highbrow way, saying, well, I deal with evidence. I don't deal with mystical stuff. I mean, that is out there somewhere on YouTube. And yet I was, as I say, social media smart about this. I was YouTube smart. I'd never really read the evidence for myself like most of the Bible scholars today. And I'm frustrated that Bible scholars are really still not on board with the Shroud, to be honest with you. So I've got my work cut out for me.
Well, let's see if we can help rectify any of that today, more even just by piquing interest. And we'll put a bunch of links in the show notes after this live stream goes out, both to your ministry, to your books, but particularly to many of the studies that we'll cite along the way, which I think will be helpful. But maybe for people, this is their first look into the Shroud of Turin. When you want to give us a little bit of a window, just what is the Shroud?
Yes, so the Shroud of Turin is in Turin, Italy. That's why it's called the Shroud of Turin. A shroud is a burial garment that was used to wrap the body of Jesus. It's referenced in all four canonical Gospels, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Most famously in John chapter 20, verse 8, it is not until John saw the Athonia in Greek, or the Sudarium in Greek, or the Sindon in Greek. Those are the three Greek burial terms used, and I have my Greek New Testament right in front of me. Kata Yohanan, I'm looking at John 20, right here at Sudarium in verse 7. When John sees that evidence, he believes. He saw and he believed, John 20, verse 8. It's a powerful passage. And so what we're talking about right now, Dan, for those that are just pulling up to it, it is in Scripture. Jesus is buried in a borrowed tomb according to Jewish burial traditions. And in my new book, which I've just finished, I talk about the hundreds of burial shrouds that we have from antiquity, and we have many burial shrouds from the land of Israel. We don't have any burial shrouds, though, that have an image embedded, I'm being very careful with my words, within the shroud that has correspondence with the ways in which Jesus of Nazareth was not only buried, but the ways in which he suffered and was executed. And so this is a burial cloth that has the image matching all the descriptions of Jesus of Nazareth in the Gospels. It has blood all over it. It is both a relic and an artifact. There are only two things in the Catholic Church that have the status of both relic and artifact. This is very important for the scientists who are listening to me or watching, because a relic cannot be studied through the physical sciences, but an artifact can. And the Sudarium of Oviedo, which I think is the key that unlocks the shroud, and the shroud itself are the only two artifacts that the Catholic Church have that have both the status of artifact and relic. So does it sound too good to be true that we have an artifact that has the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus all in one artifact? I used to be a skeptic myself until I began studying the evidence, studying the peer-reviewed journals, investigating it, going to see the shroud, meeting the mathematicians and scientists and the 102 academic disciplines that have studied the shroud for more than 600,000 hours of experiential research, did I become persuaded. And without a doubt, I believe it's the physical evidence of the resurrection.
And that's all quite a wild supposition, because at this point, what we're talking about is an artifact that has the evidence of the death of Jesus historically, in that it is a burial shroud of his physical burial in a tomb, as opposed to just him being left to be exposed and eaten by wild dogs, as some skeptical biblical scholars have proposed over history. And then also with this image, which we'll get to, potentially evidence of a resurrection as well. And so this would make it the most remarkable piece of physical evidence. Some have even dared to say perhaps it's the fifth gospel in physical form, in that it's not just the writing record of eyewitnesses of the events. No, this is something physically left behind as tangible evidence of the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. If it is genuine, that is a wild piece of evidence in the case for Christianity, and certainly something that people that are agnostic or skeptical of Christianity's central claims and the miracle at the heart of it should take seriously and be willing to investigate, because there is a lot wrapped up with that. Well, as someone who then has made that shift, now you're saying you're certain that you've got here true physical evidence in the Shroud of Turin, that this is the Shroud of Jesus. Originally, I think many people who dive in will do a Wikipedia analysis, and they'll come across the carbon dating, the C14 test that was done in 1988. That pointed towards it having medieval origins. And the provenance history of the shroud, I mean, we have the first undeniable evidence of it in history in the 1300s, and not long after, it was rejected by the local bishop in a report to the church saying that, no, I think this is a forgery. Then you've got this carbon dating test done nearly 600 years later, which says, yeah, it seems to point towards the 1200s to 1400s, something like that, as the origins for the linen. That's the final nail in the coffin. And everyone assumed then that this is a medieval forgery. Why? What leads you to overturn that carbon dating? Why don't you see that as the nail in the coffin, as many skeptics point to?
Absolutely. So if you look at the shroud itself, the shroud is 14 feet 4 inches long by 3 feet 7 inches wide. And if we had the shroud in front of us right now, we would see that where the carbon sample was out itself, and it's been documented by scientists that right there in the top left, and I've been right here in the chapel of the Holy Shroud. It smells beautiful. They have lilies all over the shroud, which is just
amazing.
A beautiful setting, and I have footage in this very spot. But in the upper left-hand corner is where the shroud sample was taken. This picture is actually in reverse for some reason. So I don't know if I'm seeing it in reverse, but on the shroud itself, it's the upper left-hand corner where that rectangle is cut out. I might be seeing it in reverse on this stream. So if you're looking at the shroud, in the upper left-hand corner, you'll see that there are snippets taken. And there is about a pinky sample that was taken off the shroud. It's about the size of our pinky, Dan. And that was supposed to be studied by 7 different labs. And you are correct in that the laboratories came back, only 3 studied it, 1 in Arizona, 1 in Oxford. And they came back and they revealed that their findings stated that the carbon sample dated to the medieval period beginning in 1260, 1280. And around 80 years beyond that. And yet, what's interesting, what no one can explain, is the shroud sample actually the dating of it gets earlier and earlier the closer you get to the center of the shroud, which makes no sense. It baffles scientists. I interviewed Paulo de Lazzaro myself, who's a physicist who studies, and we'll talk about him in a little bit more, but he does not even believe the labs actually tested the shroud itself. They believe that the sample is contaminated. What most scholars believe who've looked at the carbon dating, and this is where you have to bother to learn and actually read the carbon dating because it's rife with erroneous materials, the results. There's cotton fibers that are woven into the linen shroud. And that's a problem because the linen shroud that Jesus was buried in was fine linen with no cotton, no invisible weave. And so the sample is contaminated and probably was, in fact, just simply patched after surviving the 1532 fire. The shroud has survived at least 3 fires that we know of, and so it's unremarkable. I mean, carbon is smoke is carbon, right? And so there's carbon and there's DNA, by the way, all over the shroud as well from the medieval period. I mean, this was used in a variety of different ways. I saw the box. I literally investigated the box with the molten. The reason there's lines on the shroud is the shroud was folded up, and when it survives this fire, it literally has molten scorching on it. And so for that reason and many others, the shroud community that studies it and that looks at the science, no one appeals to the carbon dating anymore to say that the shroud is inauthentic because the sample is so contaminated. Also, the British Museum, the British Library, rather, for 29 years suppressed all of the raw data on the shroud, which is very odd. And again, you know, my friends, I have a lot of friends and a lot of shroudies, that's what they're called. And so they're very careful. We don't think that these scientists had bad or impure motives or, you know, were just simply doing their science. But it is odd that the raw data was suppressed for 29 years. I'm speaking this summer at the International Shroud Conference, which is happening here in America in St. Louis. I would encourage people to check it out, with the French attorney who, Dan, through the equivalent of a Freedom of Information Act, was able to actually finally, he was the one who got access to the raw data of the carbon-14 dating, which is remarkable. And so the other piece to this is the Sudarium of Oviedo, which many people overlook, which is the face cloth that is mentioned in John 20, verse 7, because that has all of the hallmarks of history and antiquity as well. We know it's been in Spain since the 600s, escaping the Islamic conquest. And so and that has the same blood type as Jesus, as type AB blood is the blood of the man, of the crucified man. So if those two are from the same article, which I believe they are, I mean, that completely obliterates. That's really the key that unlocks the dating of the shroud, because it shows, again, that the carbon-14 dating is erroneous.
Have we had updated carbon tests that supply a different date from other parts of the shroud? So if the concern was that it was originally taken from a corner or a weave that had been replaced, or that the sample was merely leftover smoke remnants from the fires that it endured rather than the fibers itself, has there been updated testing that has given a different timeline for when they think the linens may have been produced?
There has not.
Okay. Is that strange in and of itself? Because as a skeptically minded person, they might look at a situation like this and say, surely if the Catholic Church, who are now in control of the shroud, or it's under their care, have the ability to be able to produce the shroud for further testing, is the secrecy with which it's kept, is that a mark against its authenticity? Should that give us room for pause?
I think anything can give us room for pause. Anything can cause someone to doubt. I think when you learn, though, how all antiquities are cared for, it becomes somewhat mysterious. How all of these places, it is not a black and white world of artifacts. I know that well from all the archaeologists that I work with, and I'm not surprised, because the shroud was left to the Pope himself. So right now we have we just have a new Pope just now, and so only the Pope can give authorization for the shroud to even go on display. And here's, I think, having been now and seen the shroud for myself, I can add a little bit more to this. There are two huge enemies right now of the shroud, and we're concerned very much that the image is fading on the shroud. And so the image is kept right now in what's called a reliquary. And this reliquary is designed by a company in Turin, Italy, that actually designs all of the equipment for the International Space Station, Dan. So this company is fantastic. And I mean, this box looks like something from outer space. And the shroud itself, and it's in a box that looks like the size of a large dining room table. And the shroud has argon gas that is swapped out twice a year. I met with my friend Enrico, the chemist who's responsible for maintaining the argon gas in the shroud, okay? And he's the one who told me oxygen and light are the enemy of the shroud. And so they are so concerned, they being the Catholic Church, with the preservation of the shroud, they're really not that interested in educating people on the shroud. And that's what I learned having gone there. They don't really care about using the shroud to educate people. Their main concern, truly, honestly, their only concern, and you can tell this by how weak their museum is in Turin to see the shroud. I mean, it's a very dated, old museum. I have a much better traveling exhibit myself that I bring to churches and universities that people can learn about on my website, much more impressive. But I believe they just have no interest in educating people about the shroud. And that's
Well, can we talk
firsthand
then?
knowledge
Yeah.
based on being there myself. I think they're just overly concerned with preserving it.
Yeah, and that's entirely fair enough. I mean, you've got something that's 2,000 years old, and that's one of the questions that people have is, if this genuinely was 2,000 years old, as some of the other evidence we'll explore in a moment points towards, should we expect that linens would survive that long? I mean, one of the problems in manuscript history is that the papyrus and even parchments that much of the early documents were written upon, it just doesn't survive very long, particularly in humid environments. And so that's why our Oxyrhynchus and Egyptian papyrus discoveries are so significant, because it's such a dry, arid place. But should we expect that the shroud would have survived this long? Is that another mark against its credibility?
Shockingly, yes. We should not be surprised that the shroud lasts this long. Linen, given the right circumstances, will last for ever. I mean, basically, we have much older. In fact, I have a good friend who studied textiles at Baylor University, and she studied the Tarkan dress, which is 3,000 years older than the shroud itself. I always show images of the Tarkan dress when I lecture on this because of its antiquity. It's a linen shirt, a linen blouse that looks like you could wear it today, quite honestly, and it's 3,000 years older than the time of Jesus. And so we shouldn't be surprised. What's shocking, though, so we shouldn't be surprised that we have linen shrouds. And like I've already said, we have many other linen shrouds from the first century that have survived. I mean, there were many Bible scholars who thought that the scripture was erroneous, that Hansen's disease did not exist in the first century, so Jesus didn't heal people of leprosy. And then that we found the tomb of the shroud. I write about this in my new book, and the tomb of the shroud was so airtight that flesh remains were still on the body of the man of the shroud. That's why it's called the tomb of the shroud. And within the flesh of the man who was discovered, it was clear that he had died of leprosy or Hansen's disease, which showed, again, that the scripture's miracles about Jesus were accurate. So we have a shroud from the first century, and we have a man who died from leprosy based on the shroud. So we shouldn't be surprised at all that we have a shroud that is that old. What's shocking about the shroud is the image and the blood that is embedded within it.
Well, let's talk about that, because I guess the image is what separates this shroud from the dozens, hundreds of other shrouds from antiquity. There was a photograph that was taken in 1898 that shocked the world, because this photograph revealed an image that was otherwise mostly imperceptible entirely to our field of vision. It's the negative of the photograph that allows us to finally see it. I'll pull up a picture here so that everyone is able to see this. This is sort of the photographic negative below of the shroud, as you shared, and this long cloth, this linen, is what your kind of wraps around you lengthways. So it's got both the front and the back of the man. Do you want to walk us through this discovery and the image and its significance a little bit?
Yeah, this is where it puts goosebumps on your body, because I actually saw the image, by the way, the image from 1898 I just was with.
The original?
Yeah, the actual image. In
Wow,
fact, I saw
that's
all
cool.
the images. There's been around 7 different official photography sessions. You kind of think about family photos annually. There's been like 7 photos of the shroud throughout history now since 1898. Photography is invented in the 1840s. In 1898, Seconda Pia, who's a lawyer for a upcoming, that's what he is, his profession, so he's a hobbyist. I don't even know if there were professional photographers in the 1800s. I should probably know that, but he, as a hobby and as a blessing to his church, and of course there's no electricity in the chapel where the shroud is being held, so he has to build scaffolding, he has to use a generator for the exposures. I saw the camera that he used, which was fantastic. It used glass plates, so this is before film. And he takes this photograph, and he's in the darkroom, and never more appropriately does he say the words, "Oh my God," when he saw the face of the man of the shroud. Because as your viewers can see with us right now, the image in the negative is actually the positive image, where you can see all of the details. And this is what's striking about the shroud. No scientist can explain how there is an image in the shroud. This image that we're seeing right now is superficial. I have an entire infographic in our traveling exhibit that explains this. It's razor thin. And this is a herringbone weaved garment. Okay, so it has herringbone, and there's like Z's. You can see these Z zigzags in the herringbone weave, and so that weave is made up obviously of threads, and each thread is made up of up to 220 fibers, Dan. And there you go. That's a beautiful photograph. And so those threads come together with the weave, but each of those threads is made up of around 220 fibers. The blood is soaked through. So the blood is on hundreds, probably thousands of fibers of each thread. However, the image itself is superficial enough that it only penetrates 2 to 3 fibers of each thread on the weave, which is the shroud. I hope that makes sense, what I'm trying to explain to people. The image does not absorb all the way through like the blood. You can't see the image on the back side of the shroud. So like if we flipped the shroud around, all we would see is the blood stains and the scorch marks. Because when you see the shroud itself, if you don't mind going back to the other image, the side-by-side, you can see we're looking at two different things. We're looking at contact elements on the shroud. So like, often people will first see the 16 triangles. Those are patches from the fire. They'll see the upper right-hand corner, which was actually cut off and given to people as gifts. Can you imagine if you were given a piece of the shroud as a gift? And then, of course, the upper left-hand corner is the carbon-14 dating. The lines are the scorch marks, and then there's water stains. So we're looking at a shroud that has survived a lot of calamity. But then the second thing we notice is the image itself. And this is what, again, I have firsthand knowledge now. I've not just read the reports. I've met with Bruno Barberis, the mathematician, and I've filmed with him, who is at University of Turin, not as a theologian, Dan, but as a mathematician, and says there's a 1 in 200 billion chance that this is not Jesus, meaning our odds are very good that this is Jesus. And he's been with the shroud itself over 100 times. I'm not talking about a replica. I'm talking about when the president of Italy sees the shroud, Bruno Barberis, who I can now call my dear friend, because we had several dinners together in Italy. He's the one who shows the president of Italy the shroud itself. And so this image is what has baffled scientists. And so you can see that it's one long garment, Dan, and it covers the body. So when Jesus' body would have been lifted up, likely by Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, maybe others, and it was placed on top of this shroud, and then the shroud covered over the head and then went all the way down over covering the feet. So that's the sindon for the Greek people that are watching who read the Greek New Testament. That is the sindon that covers it like a pita or like a wrap, okay? And then we have the athonia, we have the strips of linen that cover the body to keep the hands together, the feet together, the mouth shut. And then we have the sudarium that we can get into if you want as well. And so that right there, those images that we just saw, which I never get tired of seeing, are what kicked off the scientific exploration of the shroud, which came to culmination in 1978 with the Shroud of Turin research project, which then continues to baffle the best scientists today, who I've met with and now researched with, about we cannot explain it. The best scientists of the day cannot explain how this image is in the shroud. And what's really cool is if for people that have mobile phones, which is probably everybody, if you invert the colors on your camera, I do this with live audiences now. I think I did it on the Michael Knowles show, where if you do classic invert on your phone and hold it up to, you can do this on your computer screen at home. You can go to Wikipedia and pull up a picture of the shroud, and if you invert your camera the colors, do classic invert or color invert, and you hold up your phone and trace it, you can see the image.
That's
right
amazing.
there, like an X-ray. It's like you're in the dark room with Secunda Pia. So I always do that with people in our live events, and it's so fun because you get to see so many more details than you see with the naked eye.
So this image, part of the interesting feature about it is encoded with three-dimensional information,
Yes.
which is part of the inexplicable nature of things. So I'd love you to speak
Okay.
to that in a moment. But what are the alternative theories if you were to say, no, I don't want to believe that this is some kind of radiation imprint that's left by a supernatural event like the resurrection of Jesus? I mean, the major alternative largely has been some kind of forgery that's done with pigment or paint textiles or some other way of creating this image. Why is it that you think that scientists are baffled by the nature of the image?
Well, and I hope I'm speaking to some Bible scholars that are watching, because I would say you're irrational if you believe it's a hoax. What would it take for you to believe anything from history? If one thing scientists have proven, Dan, and I'm very careful to use these terms, I've learned to be very careful with them because of how these videos all go viral.
Yeah.
One thing that the Shroud of Turin research project has proven is that the Shroud of Turin, the image in the shroud, is not man-made. Meaning there is, as you rightly just pointed out, and by the way, I applaud you. Unlike most people that interview me, they don't get the dates right or the places right, and you've obviously done all your homework on this, so I really appreciate the level of this conversation, so thank you. But as most of them find out, there's no dye, there's no paint, there's no pigment. The image is not man-made. And so for precious believers who are watching this right now, and I meet so many fine Christians, and it's like I have to give them permission to investigate the shroud. They're afraid that they may be involved in some kind of idol worship. Well, an idol, or to use the authorized King James Version, a graven image is an image made by hands. Well, Barry Schwartz and his team with the Shroud of Turin Research Project, STIRP is how they're called. If you read something and you see the acronym STIRP, that's the Shroud of Turin Research Project. Those are the 33 scientists. Dan, I hate to keep saying this. I mean, I've met most of the scientists who are still alive who are part of the Shroud of Turin Research Project. Most of them were joking and giggling, thinking they had a free trip to Italy, and they were having drinks in the lobby saying, give me 15 minutes, as Ray Rogers said, in the scientific method, and I'll prove that it's a hoax. They weren't laughing 15 minutes in, and they later all published, years later, in peer-reviewed journals, that we don't know what it is, but it's not man-made. So I would say that, I would ask, are you irrational if you read all of these scientific studies and still want to believe it's a hoax, that it can be reproduced in a way that we understand? It can't. So because I'm not irrational, I don't buy into any of the alternative theories.
And I guess that means that we have no ability to technologically replicate something
Correct.
like this. I remember reading one paper where they gave 6 options for how they thought it could be created, 5 of them man-made, and one of them just a radiation imprint. But there's no known technology that we have that could create this kind of imprint using radiation. And talk to us about the 3D nature of the image, because many people would say if it's a forgery, you're going to have, I guess, a pictorial representation like you'd normally have in a painting. There's no paint strokes, obviously, but this is a 2-dimensional image. What do they mean when you say it's encoded with 3-dimensional information?
Yeah, this is almost like we're going outer space to something in the Star Wars universe. I mean, it's so wild. So Eric Jumper and his colleague at the Air Force Academy, they're professors at the United States Air Force Academy in Colorado Springs. And they have a VP8 image analyzer. This is the 1970s. The VP8 image analyzer was designed to study the effects of the atom bomb, okay, on surfaces. So that's why they had it. Again, most of the Shroud of Turin research team are from Los Alamos Laboratories, Sandia Labs. These were men and women who worked on the nuclear bomb. They're weapons scientists. And so Eric Jumper, who's a physicist at the Air Force Academy, they take a picture of the shroud like you just had, and they scan it with the VP8 image analyzer, which, by the way, is an analog computer. And they see that there is a topography, there is 3D information encoded in the shroud, and I saw this in Turin, that literally shows that the image is 3D. And when they put a image of their grandchildren through, or any other 2D image, it's smeared, there are not distinctive patterns. It looks like, one of my boys just kind of drew it outside the lines. But then when they would put the image of the shroud back through, this is what would pop out. And this is 1976. And Eric Jumper puts it through the VP8 image analyzer, reports his findings. Here's the device that, again, was cutting edge in the 70s because they were studying the effects of the nuclear bomb on surfaces. And they say, wow, this is very interesting. So right here, this question you're asking is what kicks off the scientific group called the Shroud of Turin Research Project. In other words, had there never been a VP8 image analyzer, and had we not had the opportunity to see that this artifact contains 3D topographical information, there would have never been a 1978 Shroud of Turin research project that spent 120 hours with the shroud in Turin, Italy. Isn't that fascinating?
It's amazing. Yeah, it's really interesting. And one of the things that I've appreciated as I've researched the shroud personally, and we've talked, about various different arguments in your books, Body of Proof, and others lay them out in the case for Christianity. And you've got evidence from the heavens above and how creation speaks in Psalm 19:1 and Romans 1:20, and all of the cosmological and teleological and moral and ontological, all the various arguments that are normally used in philosophy of religion conversations. And then you've got the historical arguments more broadly from the text of the New Testament and the eyewitness testimony and the early creeds from Paul in 1 Corinthians 2. That's been our normal way of kind of coming at this. What's so interesting about the shroud, though, is a piece of potential physical evidence for the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus is what is captured in the shroud when it comes to the sufferings of Jesus. And you spoke before about one of the scientists who studied the shroud giving the figure of 1 in 20 billion, that this is Jesus. And that's not just based on the timing of when we can date many of the other features like the pollens and stuff, but this is particularly based on the kind of wound patterns that the shroud reveals. So I'd love you to speak to what we see when we actually analyze the image of the shroud. What does that reveal about the experience of the man of the shroud?
Yeah, it's very moving, and this is where I did put my area of specialty on, because I have studied at a terminal level the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus. I know all about Roman execution. I know all about how the Romans crucified their victims. And I also know that Jesus is crucified in a particularly heinous and shameful way. He is crucified between two criminals. And yet when you look at this right here, this is a horizontal schematic that shows all of the different scourge and wound marks that the body of the crucified man endured. And what takes it beyond all doubt to me, Dan, is the head. When you look at the scalp, the head, the face of Jesus, there's over 50 penetration marks. And this is from a crown of thorns. No one was crucified that we know of from antiquity with a crown of thorns other than, you guessed it, Jesus of Nazareth. And one thing that I want our audience to realize is when we look at, you can go buy all the Loeb Classic series. And what's fascinating to me is, do you know the most detailed accounts that we have of Roman crucifixion are found in 4 books from antiquity that you may be familiar with? So the 4 most detailed accounts of Roman crucifixion are Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Roman crucifixion was so shameful, it was reserved for non-citizens of the empire, that the Roman historians like Tacitus and Suetonius don't even describe it. And so the most descriptive sources that we have for the way in which individuals were crucified by the Romans, shockingly, come out of the New Testament Gospels. And so I want to make sure people realize it's not like there's a library out there that is something we can appeal to and say, oh, see, Jesus wasn't crucified the way that he was, quote unquote, according to history, supposed to be crucified. We really don't know that much description from the Roman historians of how people were crucified. We have remains, we have a couple of remains of crucified victims, but this is the real shocking part. So what we're seeing here is on one side you have the back of the image, and then on the other side you see the front, and that's that wound pattern according to the scalp that matches the crown of thorns. And We have this in our traveling exhibit. You can see photographs of this. The crown of thorns was made and fashioned in a way that was truly a crown. It was not a wreath. It was not some kind of sweatband around the forehead. This was a crown of thorns that would have penetrated the entire scalp and head. And it's fascinating to me because I always love sharing Romans 5:8 when I get to this point. Romans 5:8 says that God demonstrated his love for us and that while we were sinners, he sent his very best. He didn't send someone else. He sent his son to die in our place. And the crown of thorns to me is a demonstration of God's love for me. I was having a really stressful night last night. And that's kind of my normal life, as you know, being a dad of 4 boys. I'm a dad of 4, you're a dad of 3. So stress is kind of a common denominator of our home. And it's easy to kind of forget in the natural that God loves you, and we need reminders constantly that God still loves us, that he's still with us. And one of the unique payoffs for me of studying the Shroud has been this constant physical reminder that Jesus didn't say violets are, roses are red, violets are blue, I love you. He showed us in a way that was undeniable how much he loved us. And he goes to the cross. And if you don't mind bringing back that wound pattern, I can walk through a few more.
Yeah.
So we have the crown of thorns. Then we have the Roman scourging. I actually had some flagrums actually created in New Zealand, of all places, and the gentleman did an amazing job. And I wanted a recreation of a Roman flagrum because we know that Jesus is lashed, according to the Shroud, 372 scourge marks. So if you look at the back, and then if you look at the legs, both the front and back, if you look at the forearms in the front, you're going to see these linear, these scratch marks. Those are all lash marks from being scourged. I think John 19:1 is one of the most underappreciated passages in all the Bible, and it says, "And Pilate had Jesus scourged." These Roman flagrums, they had 3 they had 3 ropes on them that were tied with these lead dumbbells. So every single lash created 6 contusions. And so there's not a part of the body, including the pelvic region, that is not completely abused and lashed and wounded. It's interesting, too, that the Shroud gets the wrist correct. Most Christian medieval art has the holes in the palms. And yet, of course, for the Greek scholars, palm, hand, wrist, same Greek word. But the Shroud gets it right because the Shroud shows that the crucified man would have been nailed through his wrists, not through the palm of his hand. And the Shroud, interestingly enough, gets that right. No bodies are broken, no bones are broken on the Shroud. I'm always careful with that because the Shroud does show that he has a broken nose. I don't mean an actual bone was broken. I mean he has a separated septum. There's all kinds of facial
And the Gospels
contusions.
recount that he was beaten right throughout the night of shady trials.
Exactly. He's taken to Caiaphas's home. There's some really phenomenal work coming out by Tom Schmidt with Oxford University Press that I cite in my new book, that Josephus himself would have been acquainted with the people that were at the trial and execution of Jesus. And there, again, shows correspondence from Josephus and how Jesus was crucified. We see the scourge marks, and we also see, by the way, the blood. There's blood all over the Shroud. And by the way, the side wound, that's important to point out. The side wound is right there. It's next to that triangle, so some people miss it, Dan, but the side wound goes right through rib 5 and 6. That's where the side wound. Remember, so his legs were not broken, but just to make sure he's dead, the Roman centurion stabs him through all the way to the heart. The Bible says that blood and water flow out. So we know that pulmonary edema flows out of him. It's also coming out of other orifices of his body. And so when you look at this, you're reminded in a very tangible, realistic way, the ways in which Jesus not only showed his love, but experienced the wrath of God for our sin in every way.
And I guess it's this particular wound pattern that is what corresponds so well to the descriptions in the Gospels themselves, that you've got him being crowned with thorns, that mocking symbol where the soldiers do that and pretend to bow down and worship the King of the Jews, and just that incredible biblical image of Jesus being crowned with our curse, these thorns being descriptive of the curse on creation in Genesis 3. You've got the shoulder abrasions where he's carrying the heavy patibulum for the cross along what we now call the Via Dolorosa, or the path from the Roman fortress Antonia all the way to where he was killed at Calvary. You've got the knee contusions where perhaps he stumbles and falls, or where he falls during the beatings. You've got all of these scourge marks. You've got the marks of crucifixion. You've got the spear wound. It's this unique patterning which is so descriptively correspondent to what we see in the gospel literature, which themselves, as you described, are very expressive in terms of the passion or the suffering of Jesus. So is this, in your mind, part of the overwhelming case that has convinced you, just sort of seeing these wounds? How does that impact your personal faith?
That's a great question, Dan. And so if we know that the image itself is not a hoax, it's not man-made, then we have to compare the image with what we know of what the scriptures tell us. And when we look at the Jesus of the New Testament, we see complete correspondence with the Jesus of the New Testament and the corresponding wound marks and the image itself in the shroud. And how it's affected my faith is it again shows that we have physical evidence of the resurrection. This is not a death cloth. This is a resurrection cloth. It's a cloth that actually shows us we always have hope. We have hope that is undieable. We have a living hope, 1 Peter 1:3 says. And it shows that, too, there's an interesting, in these, quote, end of days, there's an interesting controlled revelation of technology tied, I think, to these amazing new technological discoveries. There's a controlled revelation, these new discoveries, and of course, God could have it to where, a VP8 image analyzer in 1978 is around that studies the nuclear bomb that shows, wait a minute, there's 3D information. No one in the medieval age could have done that. There's over 30 things a forger would have to know and get perfectly right to be able to forge what we have in the shroud itself. And so it's impacted my faith again, and just simply re-emphasized and reaffirmed that the Gospels get it right. We have 89 chapters in the Gospels. Only 4 of them deal with the infancy narratives. 2/3 of the Gospels deal with the final 8 days of Jesus' life. And it comes to culmination in this very descriptive narrative of Jesus' death, burial, and resurrection. And for me, it shows the greatness of God's grace, because it should have been my body hanging on that, should have been my wrists that were penetrated, should have been my hand, should have been my head in the crown of thorns, but it wasn't. God said, no, I'm going to give it my best in your place. It's grace in its finest form, and to me, it always sounds too good to be true, and that's how we know we're talking about grace.
It's interesting that you often have the critique that the more we understand about the universe, the less religious people are going to become. But it's precisely the advances in technology, like discovery of cosmic fine-tuning. And we've had my good friend Luke Barnes on, the physicist who spent his life wrestling with that. And this discovery at the very depths of nature, creation itself, you've got these fingerprints of profound design to allow for intelligent life. And so too then this witness from history. The deeper we're able to technologically explore the shroud, the more it seems to be revealing patterns that we have no explanation for how this could happen. And I guess the radiation explanation is that at the point of Jesus' resurrection, whatever process that was done supernaturally to raise him from the dead is what has left this imprint on the shroud itself, which is a really kind of unique hypothesis, I guess. But also some have called it the first selfie. Jesus took the first selfie in human history at the point of resurrection by imprinting this image onto the shroud. You've spoken quite a bit about the blood, and I find this to be another fascinating feature. Could you walk us through the significance for why you think the blood is evidence against this being a medieval forgery? Right.
Well, again, if we wanted to forge this, we would have to kill someone, Dan, because it's human blood on the shroud. It's not animal blood, it's human blood. And then we would have to find someone of Semitic origin to kill. because it's type AB blood, which is actually the rarest blood type in the world. I have a good friend of mine from Lebanon. He's type AB blood. I met someone at our Shroud event in Albuquerque who is type AB blood. So far in all of my tour speaking around the world on the Shroud, I've met 2 people that have type AB blood. Again, it's less than 5% of the world's population because it's Semitic blood. So we would have to know that, by the way. If we were going to forge this, you and I would have to know people's blood types in the medieval era. So I'll just leave that with you in the audience. And then we'd have to kill this person. Well, first we'd have to actually get his blood as he's dying. And then we would have to keep some more blood after he dies, because the blood on the side wound is actually post-mortem blood, whereas the blood throughout the body on the other marks of the shroud is not post-mortem blood. I want to make sure people understand that. Remember, Jesus is already dead on the cross. Remember, Pilate is surprised that he's dead so quickly. Again, this shows the particularly demonic way he's scourged, and not just scourging, beaten at Caiaphas' home, beaten by everybody. His beard is plucked. There's an inverted V on the chin of the man of the shroud, and so he's so quickly dead. When they stab him, blood, that's post-mortem blood, and water come out. And so think about that. We would have to know all of those things and get all of that right to be able to produce what's on the shroud. And then we would have to make sure that the blood was fully absorbed, because again, the blood predates the image. The blood is from Good Friday, right? When he's buried. The image happens on Easter morning, 2 days later. The image does not go all the way through. It's just the blood first that goes through. Before Easter Sunday morning, it would have just been a blood-stained cloth. And other people get bent out of shape, and this is where I want to help people with their exegesis. Jesus is crucified, yes, on Friday. That is right before Shavuot. Shavuot will begin at 6 p.m. Friday night local time. They are rushing to get Jesus' body buried. It says they washed his body, but this does not mean that they completed the burial procedures for Jesus in about 1 hour, okay? Rigor mortis would have started about 4 hours after he dies, so around 7 p.m. his body begins in rigor mortis. Rigor mortis would last up to 40 hours. In our shroud exhibit, we've commissioned a beautiful life-size sculpture of what Jesus' body looked like at hour 39 in full rigor mortis the moment before resurrection. So we have that. Again, you would have to know that. There's a beautiful rendering that people will see and say, well, okay, why are his knees bent? Why is his head kind of up? Well, he died in that position. And so that is the body of Jesus in rigor mortis, tense, not flattened. And this is what his body would have looked like with the shroud Peter wrap around him, with blood all over the shroud. So again, we would have to know all of this. And then it's type AB blood. And then remember, Jesus, according to the book of Leviticus, the life of the body is in the blood. And so blood is sacred. Dan, if you and I were Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, we would have paid very close attention to the blood of Jesus, that the pulmonary edema that had been welling up in his lungs, he's suffocating. So when he dies, and by the way, he dies in a way, I don't know if I can go full screen, but he dies in definitely. A way where he dies like this. His arm, let me see if I can get it right on the camera. His arm is this way, but this arm is closer, and he dies like this, kind of in this position. And so one of his arms is bent a little bit more in a way where the blood would flow down, and that's what it shows on the shroud, and that's how his body was, according to the rigor mortis. And so that type AB blood is fascinating. It's Semitic. But then you and I would have wrapped, if we were Joseph of Arimathea and Nicodemus, we would have wrapped his face even as he's dead on the cross. This is the sudarium. I want to make sure people understand this. We would have wrapped his face with this sudarium. It's the size of a pillowcase, okay? Everybody think of their pillowcase right now. And he died. So this is before his body is wrapped in the shroud. You have his face, because they're taking him off the cross. Blood is flowing out of him. They don't want that blood to just fall on the gross dirt. That would have been so offensive in Jewish burial tradition. So they wrap his face as they bring his body down. We know his body's in probably 3 different positions before it's laid to, quote, rest on the shroud itself. At which time they take the sudarium off. They put that in the corner of the tomb. of Joseph of Arimathea. His body is wrapped with the clean, fine linen.
So in the looking at the blood, just curiosity, we've got AB blood. Obviously it's human. Obviously it's not animal. That suggestion that it's from a Semitic person, these are all things that you wouldn't know in the Middle Ages to be able to produce a forgery. We hadn't discovered DNA. We hadn't done any of the blood type analysis. So again, this is suggesting more likely authenticity rather than forgery. Do we have the DNA of Jesus from an analysis of that blood? And does that give us the ability with Jurassic Park skills to be able to come up with some
Jesus.
just interesting, can we clone Jesus? Do we learn anything about divine DNA by studying the blood?
I've been asked this 1,000 times and we don't. What it shows us is that Jesus is fully human, it's human blood, and he's also fully God. But there's so much DNA on the shroud, because when we again look at the history of the shroud, its travels, the pollen, millions of people have touched this garment, this burial garment. So the DNA would be skewed. We need more than just a few blood samples, and there are pints of blood all over the shroud if you were to add it up. But it would be so conflicted because through history, so much human contact has. People used it as a tablecloth. It was brought out during infant baptisms. This was like a party cloth in many ways. It was a celebration cloth. And so there's so much human contact with it, the DNA would be so muddled, there would be nothing specialized about it. So we don't have enough to clone him. We don't have enough that tells us anything more than what we would expect to know, that a Jewish man in the first century was crucified under the reign of Pontius Pilate, and then he was buried according to Jewish burial traditions of his day, which is in late Second Temple Judaism. He's buried in a known tomb. He is buried in a known place, not a mass burial pit. There is no evidence that would have happened, that Jesus' body would have been lingering on the cross and eaten by dogs. The only time Jewish victims were left hanging on the cross is the War of 66 to 70 AD. That's the only time we know of antiquity where the Jewish sensitivities were offended very, very, very intentionally by the invading Romans. And so none of this surprises us. It's what we would expect. It smacks of authenticity. There's actually a sober reality to it in my mind that, this is what we would expect to find of a Jewish man crucified in the first century.
And what of the discovery of pollens on the shroud as well? This seems to have another point that points towards authenticity rather than forgery.
I just led an 88-year-old man to Christ who I'd been working on for 2 years. And one of the interesting things that caused him to believe in the physical bodily resurrection of Jesus was when he's an Ivy League man, so we can 2 strikes against him for that, right? So he studied the pollen evidence on the shroud and was just fascinated by that. So we have pollen samples, we have pollen spores. These are flowers, plants. We have also dirt signatures on the shroud itself. And this pollen is unique because 2/3 of the pollen that we have on the shroud itself only blooms in Jerusalem, in the land of Israel, around Passover time, springtime. So this is it's not always in bloom. It's not like a tree that's always in bloom. This is specific pollen, and in our museum, in our traveling exhibit, we have examples of the pollen that we have on the shroud itself. But what the audience needs to know is 2/3 of the pollen only blooms in the land of Israel in springtime, and that is the pollen signature that Max Fry discovered after 5 years. Again, this is a criminologist. This is a man who worked on the Nuremberg trials, by the way, a heavyweight in his field, spent 5 years of his life tracing the pollen. Now, if 2/3 of the pollen, and again, I'm using some round numbers, people can read my book and get all the citations if they want, but 1/3 of the pollen then traces the shroud from Jerusalem up to Edessa, Turkey. That's where Eusebius said that the image of the shroud was. It was known as the image of Edessa back then. It goes from there across Turkey into Greece. It probably is in Athens. Well, excuse me, Constantinople, of course, and then from Constantinople. These are all the Pollen signatures. That's that other 1/3. We have Pollen that traces the provenance that we have of the shroud all the way to Turin, Italy, which again is fascinating to me. We don't just have pollen from Jerusalem and the land of Israel that only blooms in springtime when Jesus is crucified. Again, we know Jesus is crucified on April 5th, AD 33, or April 7, AD 30. We know the very date. So he is crucified in April, springtime, so we have that pollen. But then we have the pollen spores and traces from where we know throughout antiquity, before that kind of red line date of the 1300s, where we know the shroud was in France. We actually have pollen from that traces the travels of the shroud all the way to northern Italy.
That's such an interesting feature in the sense that these are the kind of tests, the numerous scientific tests that are being done to explore what can we tell about the provenance, the history, the origins, the dating of the shroud. Things that people probably haven't considered before in depth. They think, well, we've done carbon dating, that's it. And you're like, well, no, there's a ton of other tests that have been performed on the blood, on the pollens, and the deeper we dig, the more this does seem to trace back towards authenticity. Now,
well, and
if
on
you
the
could,
carbon dating, Dan, if you don't mind, I mean, what do we expect of on any, again, I have my Greek New Testament here. I mean, if this had survived 3 fires, how accurate would you expect the carbon dating to be? I mean, and there's a whole world of carbon dating that we can get into. We can go down the rabbit hole that 25% of all carbon dating is just thrown out as erroneous. I mean, we don't really use carbon dating in dating biblical manuscripts. They've done some of it with the Dead Sea Scrolls, but it destroys the sample. We actually use paleography to get an accurate date range, then some codicology. I did this in the Griffith Papyrology Lab in Oxford, right under the microscope. All we do is we compare handwriting styles. That's good enough in the skeptical world of biblical scholarship to give us a date range. I did this with P. Cairo 10759, my primary text known as the Extra-Canonical Gospel of Peter, and was able to date it based on paleography and another set of factors, persuasively, I might add, to the second half of the 2nd century. And even skeptical biblical scholars cite my academic work giving a date range for P. Cairo 10759 using not just handwriting style, but this case, if you will, this collocution, this whole range of data that I've given. And I'm doing the same thing with the shroud. It's really a methodology that I'm attaching to how I have traced the origins and the history of the shroud itself to get a date range that reflects an accurate period of time.
And in terms of the image of the shroud and our perceptions of what Jesus would have looked like, it's kind of a fascinating question. I think the most watched video on our channel entirely is a little 1-minute answer to the question, what did Jesus look like? And you can come at that question from a bunch of different ways, from, well, what do we know about the average height, size, skin color, shape of Semitic peoples in that region at that time? But here it seems the image on the shroud would provide a very in-depth physical description of what Jesus looked like. And you've done a bit of work tracing that history throughout the church as well. Could you speak to just that shift in the 600s to all of a sudden people getting a lot more uniform throughout Europe on what they believe Jesus would have looked like?
Right. There seems to be the same source material that all of iconography seem to use. In fact, we have a slide on this, I believe, where you can see, this is medieval art of Jesus. There's no beard, kind of effeminate looking, short hair, weak. But this is nonetheless a lot of medieval art. Then boom, you have all the early iconography of Jesus. I see in the upper right corner, we see that Christ Pantocrator icon from Sinai, where one half is Christ the judge, the other half is Christ the Redeemer. This is famous at Mount Sinai. But when you look at all this iconography, and there's a lot more, by the way, when I was just in Turin, all they did was there was over 200 images from the icons that all have this same facial shape. It has the inverted V. Look at the beard in so many of them, Dan. Do you see the inverted V? It's like he has a part of the front of his beard ripped out. We see the long nose. We see the high forehead. We see all of this reflecting a similar source material that was likely the image of Edessa that was known and seen by many.
That's so interesting. I love that the scriptures themselves just give so much time to the burial clothes of Jesus, in that and then they crucified him. And
Yes.
that's quite a short summary.
Yes.
But then all four Gospels, with increasing detail in John's Gospel, which I find interesting given he was the only eyewitness to the crucifixion of Jesus out of the male disciples, and spends more time on Mary Magdalene's story, even in the resurrection as well, and the foot race to the tomb between Peter and John and all of that. But there's these fascinating extra details where he describes the sudarion, the head cloth as well. But there's just so much of a desire in Scripture to capture the reality that there were these kinds of burial clothes involved, which is just an interesting little feature then, that we've got this historical artifact popping up that seems to correspond profoundly with what they would have looked like.
Absolutely.
So given all these various pieces of evidence, if you had to, on a scale of 1 to 10, 1 being it is an obvious forgery and I'm tanking my historical career with any kind of credibility in the historical sciences by saying it is real, all the way to 10, which is, I think it's undeniably the burial clothes of Jesus. Where on that scale would you place yourself now?
I'm at a 10.
That's pretty significant.
Yeah, I'm at a 10 based on all of the evidence, based on the work I've done for the last few years on the Shroud, based on all of the scientists I've met. Without a doubt, it's authentic, and no one was crucified the way Jesus was. And so I believe we have the burial cloth of Jesus of Nazareth, and I believe that it's a resurrection cloth. I was just with Paul DeLazzo. We haven't gotten to the most exciting part, and his lab, Enea Laboratories in Rome, actually a little outside of Rome, he was able to use his expertise in lasers. He is a physicist who works in lasers. And the energy, he wanted to try to quantify the light energy it would take to produce the image that's on the shroud. Because, and this took 5 years of his life, 5 years of his research laboratories. And I asked Paulo about this. What a dear man, an amazing man, a physicist. And they were able to reproduce something similar that happened to the shroud, but using the most powerful lasers they could muster. After 5 years, about a 2 by 2 centimeter square, they were able to reproduce the image discoloration in a shroud sample using 34,000 billion watts of energy. But the energy had to happen, it's the best layman term I can use, it's cold energy. It happened so quickly. It happened in 1/40th of a billionth of a second. That's what it would. So they extrapolate their finding on this sample over the 14-foot shroud, and they surmise 34,000 billion watts of energy. This is peak energy for the physicists who are watching. I've learned to get this right. This is peak power, peak energy, but it's cold energy because it happens in 1/40th of a billionth of a second, so it doesn't scorch and just burn up the cloth. And so they were able to reproduce and then estimate or approximate the power that it took to leave that image. And so we know that it's a flash of cold energy, it's a flash of light energy that is so powerful, but faster, much faster than a blink of an eye. And that is the moment of resurrection.
That's a wild thought. If you had to put on a different hat and try and disprove or come up with an alternative explanation for the physical evidence you now have, what is the best candidate that you can marshal?
I would have to be able to reproduce the shroud itself. I think that's the only way that if someone can reproduce the shroud and its image with the 3D encoded capabilities, which no other textile has, and if they're able to reproduce all of that in some kind of scientific way, that doesn't involve AI, that is actually able to do it human contact physically, then that would give me pause. It'd be like, okay, so this is reproducible. I think that would be the best case against it, but I'm pretty sure that's not going to happen, because someone has already offered anyone £1 billion, £1 million if they can reproduce the image in the shroud, and nobody's taken them up on that offer yet.
Yeah, it's not a bad motivation.
Yeah,
the gear may be more expensive than that. I've
Yeah.
often thought something like this, that the best explanation is going to be an alien one, that you've got advanced technology from another planet that's
Yeah,
able
a
to
Mayan.
reproduce something like that. And the resurrection of Jesus in general. It's like, if you appeal to advanced aliens, that's probably the best way for you to get around the historical case for the resurrection of Jesus. It doesn't deal with fulfilled prophecy, and which I think then shows a better supernatural or religio significant context. But I'm sort of getting to that point, I think, with the shroud too, where I'm like, man, if you want to deny some kind of supernatural event like the resurrection, I feel like aliens is pretty much all you've got, and you're already in a pretty implausible realm there. Why not just accept the story from the beginning and the rest of the evidence for
And we
God's
make
existence
so many
and for
other
Christianity?
decisions. That's such a great point, Dan. And we make so many other life decisions on fewer data than what we have with the shroud. I mean, the shroud is the most studied artifact from history. As you rightly pointed out in the opening monologue, I'll summarize or paraphrase, it's the most lied about artifact. It's the most hated artifact with history. It's the most lied about artifact from history. A lot of people are YouTube smart about it, or they're TikTok smart. They've seen a 2-minute video and just completely discount it. But then I see people in city after city across America and around the world who, when I have a few minutes like this to explain the evidence and say, hey, I used to be a complete skeptic. I was conditioned with skepticism towards this. And by the way, we don't need it. The resurrection, I have an entire book called Body of Proof that gives the 7 best reasons to believe in the resurrection, and the shroud is not one of the top 7. Now, the shroud is probably number 8, Dan, but it's not in the top 7. And so we have an airtight case for the resurrection with or without the shroud, but I don't think we should be surprised. And I know this from my friend who's leading the dig right now in, I think, season 6 at Shiloh, or Americans will call it Shiloh, in Israel. With the new technological capabilities we have, the discoveries that we're on the cusp of making that show that the scriptures themselves are authentic, they're about real people, real places, real events, that this is truly God's word to us. It has stood up the critical test, but with the archaeology is Christianity's closest cousin, I always love to say, and we have points of tangency from the scripture with the material culture around us. So I'm not surprised, given how serious Jews take burial tradition, and those are all the ossuaries. When we look at ossuagium and second burial, I'm not surprised that we have physical evidence on the level of the shroud from antiquity.
Oh, super interesting. If you then had to get 1 minute with a skeptic in an elevator, and they said, look, I know you're the shroud guy. I can't believe that. Give me 5 reasons in 1 minute to convince me that the Shroud of Turin is a genuine historical artifact of the burial clothes of Jesus. Go.
Yeah, number one, science cannot disprove the shroud. Science has proven that the shroud is not man-made. Number two, no one is crucified the way Jesus is crucified from antiquity. So if the shroud is authentic, and then you look at the way in which that he's crucified, we see that it has to be Jesus. Thirdly, when you look at the crown of thorns specifically, it puts it beyond all doubt. Jesus is the only one from antiquity we know who a crown of thorns is fashioned and placed on his head. Fourthly, when you look at the 3D information that's encoded on the shroud, the topographical nature, no other textile does that, no other artifact does that. And then fifthly, the greatest scientific minds alive today cannot explain how the image is in the shroud.
Appreciate it. Well, if you're skeptical and watching this at this point, I think that's an encouragement. We always say on our channel here at Questioning Christianity that truth invites questioning. And if the Christian story really is worth believing, you should be able to scrutinize it. And the physical evidence for the Shroud of Turin is something worth scrutinizing and coming to an opinion on as one piece of a much broader case for Christianity. I wanted to just make comment, though, if I can, for a moment, Jeremiah. It is a moving piece of evidence. As someone who spent a lot of time studying arguments for God's existence, so in the realm of philosophy of religion and just more broadly the 24 or so arguments for God that someone like Alvin Plantinga would list and give lectures about, they can be persuasive to various capacities. I find that the argument for teleology, particularly in terms of the fine-tuning of our universe, I find that a persuasive argument. It's very compelling. But I'm not all that moved by it. It may be cool that God is at the bottom of the scientific glass waiting for us, but it doesn't ultimately change my heart all that much. But a dear friend of mine, co-author of a book that I wrote, messaged me and said he was glad that I was having you on to explore this theme because, and I share this feeling with him, when you look at the shroud and you see the scars and the blood and the experience of what Jesus endured, if he is the invisible God made visible and he's suffering and dying in our place for our sins, this physical evidence, as powerful as it is in an evidential sense to prove the death and resurrection of Jesus, is also profoundly moving because it tells the story of God's love for us and what he was willing to endure. And I just found it such a moving thing to explore over the last couple of years as more of the scientific evidence has been pointing towards authenticity. Curious, I wonder if it was the dating of the carbon C14 tests right when Christian apologetics was taking off in a whole new life that meant that it has kind of just been left behind in terms of its role in the case for Christianity and in Christian apologetics more broadly. What part do you think the Shroud of Turin should have in Christian apologetics and case making?
Well, I'd love to answer that, but if you don't mind me just reversing back to the wonderful insights you were just offering. I mean, when you look at the shroud, when you look at the evidence for the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus, we see it as love in its most radical form. We see how serious God takes sin as well, by the way, something we need to discuss because sin disfigured the face of Jesus, so much so that he was beyond recognition, Isaiah's prophecies say. Now, that doesn't mean he was unrecognizable, by the way. And by the way, I want to help people with that. It doesn't mean he wasn't unrecognizable in the resurrection. Remember, the image of the cloth is a resurrection image. When Mary hears Jesus, she's able to say, Rabboni, Rabbi. You know, he was not unrecognizable. So we have to be careful when we take these messianic passages, we understand them in their context. So when I see that it's love in its most radical form for me, it does move me. I was at the Shroud Museum in Jerusalem just a few days before the Hamas attack. In fact, I was with my publishing group yesterday at a convention, and we were reminiscing because one of the crew almost got arrested. But it was in any case, we were reminiscing about the experience of filming at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre on a Sunday just a few days before the Hamas attack, and how moved we were. And then I left the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, and the very next day, I'm in the Shroud Museum, and I see the crown of thorns for the first time. I'm alone, no one's there. And it took my breath away. And I thought, almost like when Jesus said to Nicodemus, you are the teacher of Israel and you don't know these things. Like, I mean, I've spent my life studying the death, burial, and resurrection of Jesus and some very difficult academic environments and been tested and read a lot. And I had never had the experience with Jesus that I had looking at the crown of thorns, looking at the flagrum, seeing the correspondence with the wounds on the body, that the Bible is not exaggerating what Jesus went through on the cross for us. If anything, it's giving almost sober, holding back the narrative in some way. Not overly sharing how much Jesus endured. And then when I see on the shroud that there is a limestone signature from the grottos of Jerusalem on the tip of the nose, on the kneecaps, and on the feet, and I realize that when Jesus fell on his way to the cross, when he was carrying that patibulum that you rightly mentioned that weighed probably 125 pounds, Jesus himself only would have weighed around 175 pounds. When he falls and his face just skids on the ground. His nose skids on the ground. His knees are marked. And you start looking at these details. How can your heart not be moved that someone loved you that much? And then theologically speaking, he loved us when we were unlovable. He loved us when we were in a sinful enemy condition. He still came. and God sent his best for us. I mean, let that settle in. So there's no sin that I can commit. The only sin that I can commit that Jesus will not forgive is the sin of rejecting him as my Savior. Every other sin was paid for on the cross, and his blood was able to atone for it. And so when I see the blood, the beautiful blood of Jesus, oftentimes at our events, we will observe the Lord's Supper after, and how appropriately, after studying the physical evidence of the shroud, because it's so appropriate, it turns into an act of worship. Now, I'm not worshiping the shroud. I'm reminding myself, like Jesus said, do this until I come, do this in remembrance of me. I've already forgotten the question that you asked me because I wanted to come back to the insights you were making for those that are watching of like, okay, what gives? Why does this matter? And one cool thing about my son, Justin, you wouldn't mind me using his name, this has moved my son, the needle in my son's life spiritually big time, Dan. And I became very interested. I spoke on the shroud, and I have been very authentic. I've tried to be very authentic because there's a progression of Jeremiah Johnston shroud videos in the Twitter world or in the YouTube world where, I mean, there's even one where I'm like, okay, I'm not going to stake my academic reputation on this, but if it walks like a duck and quacks like a duck, it may be a duck, but I'm not going to stake let me just share what I'm learning. And my son was in the audience, and he's like, Dad, that really moved me. And, to get my son to talk about anything but football, girls, or gaming is an act of God in and of itself. So, like, when he wanted to talk about what Jesus did for us on the cross after seeing the shroud, that resonated with he's now 13, he was 11 at the time. That has allowed us to have so many conversations about what Jesus accomplished for us on the cross. And we can get a lot of things wrong from the Bible. We can't get the gospel wrong. We've got to get the gospel right. The gospel is not hard. You don't have to believe a lot or know a lot to become a Christian. It's the deity, death, and resurrection of Jesus. It's 1 Corinthians 15, 3-8. That's all you have to know. To the facts of the gospel and placing your faith in Jesus, the resurrected Jesus of the New Testament, and you're forgiven immediately and forever. And that shalom with God doesn't increase or decrease. That's Romans 5:1. Therefore, having been justified by faith, we have shalom with God through Jesus Christ, not through my efforts, through what Jesus did, and we see what he did through the shroud.
I love that. And I look forward as my boys continue to get older to talk with this. Maybe we'll have to come and visit your shroud exhibit over there at Prestonwood.
I'm waiting
it would
for
be great.
A Brisbane invitation, Dan.
Well, mate, we've got the Canadian brother Wes Huff coming in a couple of months. We might have to look 2026 to getting Jeremiah J Johnston to. You'll probably have to get on a boat to be able to bring the exhibit with you. But we'll see. We'll see how we can get it over here to Australia for a tour.
Jet.
Yeah. Oh, that'd be great. I'm sure someone in Texas has one.
Yeah,
we can make that happen. So the original question, and I just think it'd be helpful to kind of speak to this, that apprehension that you had across your journey to saying, look, I don't want to stake my academic career on this. I feel like that's the position of a lot of people in Christian apologetics who probably haven't had either the credentials that you have nor even the access that you've had to it. And they think, I don't know exactly to what degree this should play into it. So what role do you think that the Shroud of Turin should play in case making and Christian apologetics?
Well, my wife is not going to like it that I'm going to say this to you, but there's a lot of dumb people with a doctorate too. Sometimes I have to say you have to have a doctorate to be that stupid. Some of us, we get so biased in our expertise that we're unwilling to follow the truth where it leads. And I don't mean that unkind, and I probably should ask for forgiveness. If the redhead is watching this, she won't like it that I said that. But I have seen so many very intelligent people become so closed-minded to truth. And I want to say this, the most dangerous place I can get is when I stop seeking truth. That is a very dangerous place. When I can't learn anymore, when I have a PhD from the UK and I'm published and I'm a member of SNTS, an elected member, but you can't teach me anything new, or I'm not willing to say, hey, I got that wrong, that's a dangerous place to be. That's the road to agnosticism. That's the road to being an apostate. And many have traveled that road. That road is well traveled. The bias is so overreaching. And I'm really thrilled that so many Bible scholars, to be a little bit more generous, are very interested in this. I'm going to be giving a lecture at the University of Regensburg in August on Scheintot, apparent death, something I've written on for the Society of New Testament Studies. And I'm going to be talking about how resurrection influenced Greek novels to have a whole new literary device that did not exist before the resurrection, this dying, rising God romance narrative, that how this German term Scheintot, apparent death, impacted fiction after the resurrection of Jesus. So again, I'm doing what I can to bring the resurrection back in the discourse of biblical theology and biblical scholarship. It's something that apologists need to learn. Again, update your PowerPoint slides, man. Stop giving the same sermon you've given for the last 20 years. Research, update. I'm always tinkering with my slides. I'm willing to pay and go across the world and see these things and buy the expensive book and learn this. Do I have to? No. I could speak that body of proof book for the rest of my life. But I want to learn more. I'm seeking truth, Dan. I'm following where truth leads. And it's hard because I have to think, okay, I'm really skeptical about this. And, something we haven't discussed, I thought this was a Catholic relic. And, I studied the Reformation. Audrey and I once went, the redhead, to Germany for 3 weeks. We didn't check bags because we were on the train studying all the places of Martin Luther. I went to the home of John Tetzel, the famous friar who said, every time a coin in the coffer rings, a soul from purgatory springs. So, I've seen...
Pretend to burn his hand to be able to preach hellfire.
Yes, and who would just rip people off in the name of Jesus. So I have an allergic reaction to relics, and Frederick the Wise, who supported Martin Luther and really saved his life, put away his relics at the end of his life, but I didn't realize that the Catholic Church did not receive the shroud until 2 years of probate court. The royal family, first of France and then Italy, gave the shroud through probate will to the Pope in 1985. So, and I've this has gone viral. I don't believe the Shroud of Turin research project would have ever been given permission to study the shroud by the Catholic Church. It was, again, the royal family in 1978 who still had control of the shroud, who allowed the scientific study to commence. It's important to note that. People don't realize that when you look at the timing. So it's something
Very
that we
cool.
need to get right. Sorry to preach, but I am disappointed when we have this level of information, when I see Bible scholars sitting back, staying in their silos, Dan. I've had to learn a lot about things that I didn't know about, like physicists. I've had to learn and get to know a lot of physicists to understand peak power and energy and watts and radiation and why we say this and don't say that. And it's cost me time and money. But now it's the greatest evangelism tool I've ever had. I am seeing people come to faith in Christ through this conversation we're having at an exponential rate versus anything I've ever done or been part of before.
I suspect it's going to go much more mainstream as a result of that. As people start realizing the data's coming in, there's a lot more credibility to it. They'll feel more comfortable, and maybe conversations like this will see it become much more a part of the common case for Christianity.
Absolutely.
If there was anyone watching who is skeptical, what might be a parting message that you'd want to leave with them?
Well, I was skeptical too, and I understand you're busy. I understand that there might be some preconceived ideas like I had, so there are fine people that are skeptical about this. I was one of them, and I thought it was a Catholic relic. I thought I didn't have time to research this, and yet when I began to study the data, and that's why, Dan, I'm so thankful to you for taking the time and expense to do this program today and all the effort you've done. I'm so grateful to you for that, because people are no doubt watching now and will watch for years to come. this is going to be the springboard for them to say, you know, I need to read that for myself. I need to study that for myself. You can go download the Heritage Journal that talks about the wide-angle X-ray scattering, the Waxis scattering imaging that shows that the shroud has been getting old for 2,000 years. You can download that free of charge in a PDF. You can read why scientists are saying that the shroud is 2,000 years old. You can read the hematological studies. You can print these reports. You can read about what we're learning about about the blood of the man of the shroud, that it had huge skyrocketing levels of ferritin, meaning he was having organ failure on the cross, huge levels of creatinine, not to be confused with creatinine. He was dying. Again, a forger wouldn't be able to make sure the blood had those complexities of high levels of ferritin and creatinine. You would have had to be torturing someone. I mean, it gets to a point, if you're a skeptic, it's like, wow, that takes a lot of faith to believe that much in a hoaxer. Why not just go where the evidence leads? And so I would encourage you to look into it, but don't forget the best sources we have, the scriptures. As you're reading these reports about the shroud, as you're studying the scientific reports, do what I did. Have your scriptures out to John 20, to the different gospel reports, of course, the Pauline epistles, and you can read, the Holy Spirit is good at his job, Dan. If you're a Christian and you're watching this, but you're skeptical about the shroud, I believe he will lead you into truth. Again, at the end of the day, we don't need the shroud, but that also doesn't mean, make sure you don't make this mistake. Man, I've had so many Christians, they'll get on these and they'll say, I don't need the shroud. I believe. I'm good. I don't need all this evidence. Well, you're more pious than the New Testament authors were. Let me explain that. The 7 or 8 authors of the New Testament would not have written a word of what we call the New Testament today had they not had the experience of seeing Jesus alive after he was dead. And so they needed the evidence. John needed it. He saw it and believed, the Athonia, the Syndon. And so make sure you're not having faith in faith, okay? Make sure you're following the evidence, saying, wow, if it's there, I'm going to study it. I will use it because the gospel writers sure needed it.
Absolutely. Well, Jeremiah, thank you so much for coming on to this episode and diving into the Shroud of Turin, or the Shroud of Jesus. It's been an absolute blast. I love the energy of the conversation and just the little nuggets that you've dropped all the way along, encouraging people to dig deeper into those individual studies. If people want to connect more with your work, is there a best place that they can go to be able to see that?
Please do. ChristianThinkers.com, and just a lot of YouTube videos out there, a lot of great content. We have more coming. We have an international tour right now called Who's the Man of the Shroud that we're bringing to churches. I would love to bring it to Australia. It's going global. We have 2 traveling exhibits that we take to local churches, universities. We partner and use it as an outreach, which is phenomenal. It's always free. It's always available to the public, thanks to the donors of Christian Thinkers Society, our ministry. And we have an email list, Dan, that I would love for people to sign up for, where I'm the only one who writes. So sometimes you get an email every week, and sometimes you don't if I'm on a book deadline. But when you get an email, you know it's from my hand, where I like to keep you up to date on important information when it comes to being a Christian thinker.
Great. Well, we'll be sure to put links in the show notes so that people can get all of that and sign up for that email. Just want to say thanks, Jeremiah. And to anyone who's watching this, if you're enjoying this sort of content, please do hit like and subscribe and share this video with anyone who you think it may be helped by diving into the Shroud of Turin. We cover videos here at Questioning Christianity on hundreds of different topics that help you explore how the Christian story connects to life's deepest questions. If you want to support the channel, there's links down in the show notes. You can figure out how to do that. And until next time, as always, truth invites questioning. We'll see you later.